is my great pleasure this evening to welcome you to the 7th Annual Frank Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service. This lecture is truly the high point of my 3 months tenure as Dean of the University of Maine School of Law. It is a great honor indeed to have the opportunity to meet and to present to you our distinguished lecturer, the Honorable Warren B. Rudman, and to introduce as well Judge Frank Coffin, the distinguished jurist and public servant par excellence for whom this lecture is named. We are also delighted to welcome the many family members of both Senator Rudman and Judge Coffin who are here with us this evening. Senator Rudman's cousins, Albert Glickman, trustee of the University of Maine System, and his wife Judy, Justice Paul Rudman of the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, Sam Rudman, distinguished Maine lawyer and a good friend of the law school, Mrs. Ruth Coffin, Judge Coffin's wife, and their daughters Meredith and Susan, and Susan's husband, Ed Babb. The University of Maine School of Law takes great pride in its sponsorship of the annual Coffin Lecture. The lecture reflects and celebrates the law school's strong and abiding commitment to public service and challenges us to consider new ways to ensure that the law and the legal profession continue to serve the public good. The law school has a long record of public service to Maine and the nation. The law school's faculty and students provide valuable service through the Cumberland Legal Aid Clinic, a major provider of legal services to low-income Mainers, through the Marine Law Institute, the Garbrecht Law Library, and through various student organizations such as the Maine Association of Public Interest Law, which raises funds each year to provide stipends to students who render legal services during the summer months for little or no compensation. Members of our faculty draft court and bar rules, assist with major law reform projects, serve on public boards and commissions. Our strong commitment to public service is reflected in the accomplishments of our alumni as well. Large numbers of our graduates serve with distinction in the federal, state, and local governments as judges, legislators, governors, attorneys general, district attorneys, public administrators, and as executives of nonprofit organizations. The Coffin Lecture has been the highlight of the fall semester at the law school since its inception in 1992. The lecture has brought to our community a brilliant array of talented and thoughtful individuals, from Ole and Michael Rao and the late Justice William J. Brennan, who delivered posthumously the remarks of our first Coffin lecturer, the late Joseph Rao, to last year's Coffin lecturer, former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich. Each of the Coffin lecturers has challenged us to reflect in new ways upon the powerful intersection between law and public service. And if the past is prelude, our 7th distinguished lecturer, the Honorable Warren B. Rudman, will continue in that fine tradition. Interestingly, Senator Rudman is the first Coffin lecturer with extensive experience in the legislative branch of government, although his long record of public service extends into other areas as well. After receiving his bachelor's degree from Syracuse University in 1952, Senator Rudman served in the United States Army as a combat platoon leader and company commander during the Korean War. After the war, he attended Boston College Law School and returned to his native New Hampshire to practice law. In 1970, Senator Rudman was appointed Attorney General of the state of New Hampshire, a position he held for 6 years. He was elected to the United States Senate for the first time in 1980 and re-elected by a wide margin in 1986. Senator Rudman's tenure in the United States Senate was marked by many accomplishments. In 1985, he co-authored the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Deficit Reduction Act, which sought to insert discipline and accountability into the federal budget process. Some have said that the act was one of the most significant pieces of legislation during the 1980s. In 1986, Senator Rudman was appointed to serve as vice chairman of the Senate Select Committee that investigated arms transfers to Iran, the so-called Iran-Contra investigation. In that role, he earned bipartisan recognition for his thorough and objective pursuit of the facts. Senator Rudman also served on the Senate Ethics Committee as its chair, and earlier, vice chair. He presided over many investigations, including the Keating 5 investigation of one of the nation's most notorious savings and loan scandals. Senator Rudman's record of public service has continued since he left the Senate in 1992. In that year, he formed with the late Senator Paul Tsongas and former Commerce Secretary Pete Peterson the Concord Coalition, a grassroots advocacy organization dedicated to encouraging public debate about the impact of budget deficits and the generational implications of retirement policy. Senator Rudman continues to serve as co-chair of the coalition with former Senator Sam Nunn. In 1993, Senator Rudman was appointed by President Clinton to serve on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, which he now chairs. He also serves as chairman of the Special Oversight Board of the Department of Defense investigations of the Gulf War chemical and biological incidents. And in his spare time, he practices law in the Washington, D.C. firm of Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. The law school's pride in sponsoring a lecture that brings individuals like Senator Rudman to Portland each year is matched by our pride in sponsoring a lecture named for Judge Coffin, the exemplar of a life devoted to law and dedicated public service. Judge Coffin is one of that rare breed who has served in all three branches of government: as a United States Congressman, in the executive branch as Deputy Administrator of AID, the Agency for International Development, and in the judiciary. He was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit in 1965, serving as its chief judge for 11 years. In 1986, he assumed senior status with the court, but that has not slowed him down one bit. In addition to hearing cases by assignment, he has continued to write books, teach law students, and if this is possible, has intensified his efforts to ensure access to justice for all citizens through his chairmanship of the Justice Action Group. As a former Maine Senator, William Cohen wrote to Judge Coffin on the occasion of the 1986 unveiling of the judge's portrait at the Genoux Courthouse here in Portland, "If a fair measure of the man is whether he has made a difference, you could have rested long ago. Few have served their country in all three branches of government. Few have served the federal court with such dignity and distinction. And few have been so generally recognized as a man of compassion, wisdom, and fairness." I could not have said it better myself. But I would like to add a few more words, of course. I am a lawyer after all. Also a man of great intellect, sparkling wit, and a surprising mischievousness. Recall Judge Coffin's penchant for practical jokes, several of which were described to us by Robert Reich at last year's lecture. I was going to try and find one to bring here, but when one of the clerks with whom I spoke said, "Oh, you mean like the one with the lobster in the toilet?" I thought to myself, don't go there, and I didn't. Those of us who have attended this event in the past may remember that the Coffin Lecture has a long history of sports metaphors and miscues, starting with Don Zillman's reference to the Hall of Fame pitcher Nolan Ryan, a reference which the athletically challenged Judge Coffin and the equally challenged Arthur Schlesinger, our second Coffin lecturer, found mystifying indeed. It behooves me, of course, as the new dean, to continue what has become an honored tradition at this lecture. And so it is my great pleasure to present the Mark McGuire of the federal judiciary, the Honorable Frank M. Coffin.
I told Dean Zillman that if there were any more baseball references, I'd be out for his hide, but apparently I have to live with this. And just because Mark McGuire beat Jimmy Sosa's 20-year record, I don't know. Next year I'm betting on Roger Maris. Anyhow. As for the lobster in the lavatory, that was not my brand of wit. You have to realize that though I've been your public servant for all these years, I am at the mercy of a very insidious bunch of mischievous, evil-thinking law clerks who, on April 1 of every year, pull off the most horrendous pranks on me. You'd think they'd have some respect for the elders, but they don't. Well, Dean Corey and I have crafted our introduction of our honored guest in conformity with accepted law review practice. She has written the basic text, everything you need to read, and my job is to sprinkle it with respectable footnotes. But as is true with any research assistant, I think my footnotes are important if we are really to penetrate to the real Warren Rudman. My first footnote is born of parochial pride in our speaker's Maine roots. The Rudman family, along with so many others in the late 19th century, emigrated from Eastern Europe, stopping first in New York's Lower East Side. Unlike many, they were drawn to the greener spaces of Maine. Dean Corey has mentioned the members of the Rudman clan here tonight. I would add a jurisprudential footnote. Not only are we graced by Supreme Judicial Court Justice Paul Rudman, but those of us old enough treasure the memory of his father, beloved Justice Abe Rudman. As if two Supreme Court justices were not enough for one family, still another Rudman cousin, almost a per se violation of the antitrust laws, is Deborah Politz, Chief Justice of New Jersey. Though also rooted in Maine, our speaker's father, Edward, after harvesting timber in Quebec and building houses in Portland, purchased Old Colony Furniture, an antique furniture reproduction business in Boston. He later moved it to Nashua, New Hampshire, where Warren Rudman began his civilian career. But first, as the dean has said, came a Korean War interlude of frontline service as an infantry platoon leader and later company commander. Based on Hill 468, which I take it was named because it was 468 feet high, he would lead night patrols down Parachute Valley to scout out any threatening Chinese attacks. When this war finally ended, young Rudman, still surviving on Hill 468, although wounded, was elated but sobered with a lasting perspective. Years later, during a Senate debate featuring inflamed rhetoric, Senator Rudman caught the eye of Senator Kerry, a Medal of Honor veteran, and said, "The way these guys carry on, you'd think this was important. After all, nobody is shooting real bullets." Perhaps it is this background that accounts for Senator Rudman's heritage of civility. On returning from Korea, Captain Rudman joined the family business and was put in charge of production at Old Colony. But he soon somehow sensed that neither antique nor reproduction fitted him. He was, after all, thoroughly contemporary and unarguably an original. So off he drove every night to Boston College Law School. Public service returned to his life when he served Governor Walter Peterson, first as his finance chair, then as chief of staff, finally as Attorney General. In this post, he made his mark by thoroughly professionalizing the office, establishing new divisions for protecting both consumers and the environment. He also chose as his deputy a man who was to become his closest friend, David Souter. A few days ago, I received a letter from Justice Souter in which he reminisces about Attorney General Rudman. These are his words. What we remember most was Warren's instructions to all of us in his Attorney General's office to do what we were supposed to do without worrying about the politicians. He'd take care of them. And he did that without ever making a political law enforcement decision. It's not that he wasn't capable of being a very astute politician, as everybody knows he could be and was. He just kept politics where he thought it belonged and ultimately survived not on cleverness but on integrity. Or maybe I should have said decency, for in all the years I've known Warren, I have never known him to do a mean thing. So it was that it was not his rhetoric, wit, skill, aggressiveness, or power that made him the boss we were thrilled to be working for. All those qualities and attributes were in the mix, but they were capped with Warren's outsized decency. He did the right thing, and the rest of us were proud to be standing with him. Now, I wish I could continue this paean of praise, but we live in a time of unprecedented candor. And in that spirit, I feel I must reveal to you a behind-the-scenes transaction that was crucial to the elevation of Judge Souter to Justice Souter. Some may recoil at learning of the passing of money to advance a judicial nomination. One should not speak lightly of such a matter, but I have an unimpeachable source, Senator Rudman's own recent book, Combat, 12 Years in the U.S. Senate. Here, then, is the unvarnished truth. On hearing the news of Justice Brennan's retirement on a Friday, Senator Rudman called both Chief of Staff John Sununu and President Bush. An appointment was made for Judge Souter to meet the President on Monday morning. On Sunday evening, the judge and the senator met at a certain place. Well, I might as well say it. They met at an ice cream parlor in Manchester, shortly before the judge's flight to Washington. In Senator Rudman's words, this is what then happened. When I dropped him at the airport, he was carrying an ancient, battered suitcase that his ancestors might have brought over on the Mayflower. He got out of the car, then turned to me with a pained expression. "What's the matter?" I asked. David pulled out his wallet. "Warren, I've only got $3. I gave him $100 in cash. "I ought to pin a tag on you," I told him. "You know, one that says, 'Please take this boy off the plane in Washington.'" Weeks later, after being overwhelmingly confirmed by the Senate, Justice Souter sent Senator Rudman a framed photo of him and the other justices, and mounted beneath a check for $100 with the inscription, "To Warren from David. Thanks for staking me to the job interview." After recovering from the shock of reading this, I reflect that if this be financially manipulative court packing, let us have more of it. And if this moderate, independent, courageous, and civil public servant who speaks to us tonight is an antique, by all means, give us more reproductions. I present the Honorable Warren B. Rudman.
I will tell you something after that introduction. I am glad that I never got into a situation where Frank Coffin was appointed an independent counsel investigating me. Talk about doing your homework. I want to say to the judge and to the dean how grateful I am for the invitation. I have to say to Frank Coffin that, of course, he was not only on the circuit, but chief of that circuit for a number of the years that I was privileged to serve my state as Attorney General. And I appeared before that circuit on occasions. And I can only tell you that, we in New England have been extraordinarily fortunate with that circuit. Anyone who goes back and studies the history of that circuit as it sits within the federal system knows that it's a gem. And Frank Coffin was really the luster on that gem for many, many years. And I know that a lot of my family here tonight, I know that there are many judges here tonight, and I just want to say something at the outset here, and that is that, and I've said this many times, and I wish that public officials today would think about it when they get elected, particularly to federal office. There is nothing more important than the caliber of people that we appoint to the judiciary at all levels. It is vital. With a country that is increasingly cynical with cause in many of its institutions, the courts of this country, state and federal, still are held in high esteem. And that is because over the years, and I would stress particularly here in northern New England, governors and senators have taken great care with those appointments. I got a call from the Senate historian a few weeks ago, who was a friend of mine, who said we were doing some research and we came across something absolutely astounding, and we thought you'd like to know about it because it's no great credit to me, it's just what happened. And I said, well, what's that, Jack? He said, you are the only United States senator in a particular category. I said, what's that category? He said, the category is that you appointed and nominated to the president every federal district court judge sitting in your state at this time, the judge sitting on the First Circuit at this time, and a member of the United States Supreme Court. And I reflected on it afterwards, and I thought to myself, that's wonderful, it's nice, it's appropriate, but it's so important to me personally because the kind of justice that will be meted out of the people of New Hampshire, the people of this circuit, and the people of the country, by those people that I was so proud to appoint, who all had worked for me at one time or another, is exactly what we need to convince the American people that when they go into a court, they will get justice, be they rich, be they poor, be they black, be they white, whatever they be, that justice essentially is equal for all. That is why the judiciary is so terribly important and why politicians should take such care as they put people in these offices. I am going to talk about the independent counsel law tonight, but you know, I am the author of Graham Rudman. Most people think my first name is Graham. Today is a historic day. Today is the first day of the new fiscal year, and the fiscal year that ended yesterday was the first fiscal year in almost 40 years in which we did not have a deficit. Now, you would be greatly disappointed if Billy Graham came to Portland tonight and did not talk about the Lord. And people who know me know that I cannot pass an audience like this up, at least for a couple of minutes, to talk about that issue. I just want to say that I think that the Congress, the President, deserve great credit for putting us finally on the right kind of a glide path. But make no mistake, the light at the end of the tunnel is an oncoming train. We have trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. This country is aging very rapidly, and it is very important that we take steps now lest our children and our grandchildren have a standard of living that will be totally unlike ours, because the tax burden that we will have to impose on them will be absolutely enormous. And so whenever I speak to a group on any subject, I always say, keep your eye on the fiscal ball, because it is terribly important that we do something about that now. You know, I speak tonight not as a Republican or a Democrat, but as somebody who cares about this country. And I have to tell you, when I hear some of my former colleagues down there talking about tax cuts, when this country owes $5.3 trillion, 40% of it overseas, so the interest flows out of our economy and into foreign economies, I say, wait a minute. There's a lot that we can do in this country before pandering to people with tax cuts, when most Americans care more about their children's future than they care about some small tax cut in their pocket today. So I hope that message you will pass on to your representatives from this state. I want to talk about the independent counsel law tonight, and the timing could not be better. It crossed my mind when we talked, but never did I realize that all of these things would come together as they've come together. I don't intend during the formal part of these remarks, and as you can see, they are informal. I don't intend to talk much about the President's problems directly. I will only say about that as an American, I think it's a very unfortunate and frankly a squalid situation. What will happen to it, I don't know. What should happen to it, I've got some views. Probably talk about them later. But that is really not what I want to talk about tonight. You know, the wonderful thing about the Internet, and even for people of my age who have learned how to use it, is you can dial up the University of Maine, and you can go into the Law Review, and you can find out some interesting things. And I read over the last week 3 speeches that were given here as the Coffin Lecture, one by Judge Wald, one by Drew Days, and one by Alvin Bronstein. They were very learned and intellectual addresses. I do not intend to do that tonight. I'm not sure I could do that tonight. But I hope that what I have to tell you tonight is informative and makes you think a bit about a public policy issue that I have cared deeply about long before the current situation. In the fall of 1990, I was a member of the Senate Government Operations Committee, and we had before us the reauthorization of the independent counsel statute. It was about to expire. I had, of course, sat on Iran-Contra, and I had watched what Judge Walsh had done as independent counsel, including indicting Caspar Weinberger 5 days before a presidential election. And it occurred to me that there was a great deal wrong with that statute, and it didn't make much difference whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, that everybody's ox was going to get bored one of these times, and we ought to fix it. And we ought to fix it in a way that would at least respond to some of the criticisms that had been made, some of them as far back as 1988, by Justice Scalia. More about that later. As I go through my discussion of that law, particularly through the eyes of Justice Scalia, in the case of Morrison v. Olson, the case in which, by I believe a 5-4 margin, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of that law, I want you to keep in mind 3 amendments that I tried to attach to the reauthorization of that bill and wonder, in terms of today, what they would have meant. My motivation came from feeling that we had had a revolution in this country in 1776, and one of the things that I thought that we decided is we didn't want a king. And we didn't want anybody who was totally unaccountable to the voters. And we didn't want anyone who could not be removed from office with cause, really removed from office, not just an authority to remove from office. And I saw abuses during that independent counsel investigation that troubled me deeply. And so I proposed 3 amendments. I will lead with my favorite one first because it's one that will immediately trigger thoughts in all of your minds, unless you've been on Mars lately. The first part of the amendment said that the scope that the court shall give to the independent counsel shall be narrow and defined, and it shall specify the crimes that may have occurred under the facts that have been alleged, and it may be broadened within the factual situation as referred by the court. However, it said, in the event that other matters involving the same respondent, i.e., the person being investigated, should come to the attention of the independent counsel, then they must immediately be referred to the Attorney General of the United States for reference to the sitting United States Attorney for the district in which that offense was alleged to have occurred. And that if there was a conflict, then another United States Attorney from another district would be brought in to prosecute that case. Whitewater, and then Travelgate, and then Filegate, and finally, through accident, Monica-gate. So far from the original scope that it defies any rational explanation. The second thing, which some of you who are sitting in the judiciary will appreciate. By the way, if Ralph Lancaster wants to leave at any point, he's certainly free to. I don't worry about Ralph Lancaster. Second Amendment, in order to be named an independent counsel, one should have been an active, practicing, prosecuting attorney, state or federal, or active defense attorney within the previous 15 years. On the theory that if I have a brain tumor tonight, I don't want to go to the Maine Medical Center and have the operation performed by a doctor who last performed it in 1962. Which is exactly what happened in Iran-Contra. And might I point out that in the case of the President's independent counsel, to my knowledge, he has never tried or defended a case in a trial court. The third amendment was that there would be a statute of limitations on the independent counsel, and he could only be reauthorized by the Congress. 2 years. Look, I was a prosecutor. Give me the resources of the FBI, and I can indict almost anybody in this room in 2 years. Now, I do know some things about some of you. The others, I'm just guessing, actually. So those are those three amendments, and I must say that I had lunch up in the Senate dining room with Senator Carl Levin, Democrat of Michigan, a great friend of mine, who opposed me, along with another senator named Bill Cohen, who was one of my closest friends. And the reason they opposed the amendments, not that they didn't agree with them, but the devilish thing about the legislative process in the United States Senate is that sometimes if you get a bill and you can get it up clean, so to speak, pure, just the way it's written, you might get it through. If you open it up to amendments, you'll have 100 amendments, 2 with merit, 98 without, and it goes on forever. The majority leader says, listen, either pass it clean or don't pass it at all. And they came to me and they said, you know, you're right, we ought to do it, but, you know, we really can't. And so I went quietly. Well, actually, not very quietly, but I went. I know, I haven't asked Bill his view, but I know that Carl Levin feels very strongly that those amendments should be, in fact, put on this legislation if, in fact, it is ever renewed, which, frankly, I don't think it ever will be, in my view. Now, you have to step back from those 3 things that I believed and look at the history of the law. And most people in this room are old enough to remember Watergate and to follow it. And most Americans think there was an independent counsel under a statute in Watergate. Well, of course there wasn't. And there was not a counsel in a whole string of cases, which I could cite to you. There has always been historically in the U.S. Attorney General's office, in a state Attorney General's office, the authority, when there was an apparent conflict because the appointing authority, the head of the political system in the state, was the suspected character in a particular matter, that you could bring in a special counsel, a person of high regard, great reputation, great integrity, great experience, deputize them, and say, find out if something went wrong, which is what happened with Archibald Cox, who was fired. And when Nixon took a deep breath of relief, he didn't really know who Leon Jaworski was. And if you read the history of Watergate, you know that it worked the way it was supposed to work, because there is no way it can't work if it's truly a serious matter. Unfortunately, we are saddled with a law which, in my view, ought to be repealed or greatly changed. And in preparing for this tonight, I went back and read Justice Scalia's predictions in Morrison and Olson in 1988, and they are remarkable. I commend anyone who has not read the case to read it, and if you've read it, read it again. I particularly enjoy reading the back and forth between Justice Scalia and Justice Souter, some of the wittiest in other cases since this case. They are both men who really know how to write. Scalia, in this case, either had a crystal ball or has superhuman powers. And you're going to agree when I get done going through with this tonight. Then we're going to do a Q&A and talk about this. He raised 10 points. And I want to get them right, so I got them all on paper here. And these are the things that Justice Scalia said in '88 when he said essentially, look, we can't have this unaccountable person out here. We can't do that. This isn't what America's all about. We're about accountability. First thing he said, the independent counsel will be uncontrollable. These are his words. He said, allowing removal of the independent counsel for good cause is really no limit at all. Limiting removal power to good cause is an impediment, not an effective grant of presidential control. And he got that right on target, if you look at what's going on. Can you imagine Bill Clinton announcing tomorrow that Ken Starr's been fired? You know, and pigs fly. Second, he said the independent counsel statute will let Congress shirk full responsibility over the impeachment process by delegating discretion to the independent counsel. Quote, how much easier is it for Congress, instead of accepting the political damage attendant to the commencement of impeachment proceedings against a president on trivial grounds, trigger a debilitating criminal investigation of the chief executive under this law? You think about that. You think of where we are today. And I haven't told you what I think about where we ought to go today. I'm just telling you what this law has done. The third point I can tell you from my extensive work in and around the White House over the last 4 years, 5 years, as chairman of a very nonpartisan group called the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. The third one is probably, in terms of the American people, the most damning. Scalia said, "The brooding omnipresence of an independent counsel will intimidate the White House staff and prevent them from serving the president effectively. The president's high-level assistants, who typically have no base of personal support, it is utterly unrealistic to think that they will not be intimidated by this prospect, and that their advice to him and their advocacy of his interests before a hostile Congress will not be affected, as it would be to think that members of a Congress and their staffs would be unaffected by replacing the speech or debate clause with a similar provision. It deeply wounds the president by substantially reducing the president's ability to protect himself and his staff." And let me tell you, that has happened. It is obvious that it has happened. This White House, for better or for worse, right or wrong, has been traumatized by the events of the last 7 months. He then said, "The independent counsel will cripple the president vis-a-vis Congress." Not sure he's totally right on this one, but it's an interesting point. Listen to what Justice Scalia wrote. He wrote, "It must also be obvious that the institution of the independent counsel enfeebles the president more directly in his constant confrontation with Congress. Nothing is so politically effective as the ability to charge that one's opponent and his associates are not merely wrong-headed, naive, ineffective, but in all probability, crooks. The present statute provides ample means for that sort of attack, assuring that massive and lengthy investigations will occur not merely when the Justice Department, in the application of its usual standards, believes they are called for, but whenever it cannot be said that there are no reasonable grounds to believe that they are called for." A double negative, but that's exactly what has happened, and what is happening now with the Attorney General under enormous pressure to appoint not 2, but 3 more independent counsel. The only thing that can be said for it is that the gross income of lawyers in Washington is probably up 40% this year. Justice Scalia went all the way back to former Attorney General, former Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson for his next criticism. He said, "The independent counsel turns around the age-old law enforcement maxim. Instead of being told, 'There's your crime, now find the man,' he is told, 'There's your man, now go find his crime.'" Scalia went on to say, "Therein is the most dangerous power of the prosecutor, that he will pick people that he thinks he should get rather than cases that need to be prosecuted. In such a case, it is not a question of discovering the commission of a crime and then looking for the man who has committed it. It is the question of picking the man and then searching the law books or putting investigators to work to pin some offense on him. It is here that law enforcement becomes personal and the real crime becomes being personally obnoxious to or in the way of the prosecutor himself." And I want to tell you that as a prosecutor for almost 7 years, and many of you in this room have had that authority. And in New Hampshire, it's a very interesting authority, you know. It's a statewide authority. Attorney General of New Hampshire is the only person that can convene a jury statewide. The only person can ask a court for a wiretap. The only person who can investigate serious crime. A very powerful position. And I have seen in that state, going back 30 years, terrible abuses of that position. And no one is in a position to argue with a prosecutor, particularly one that is not removable. You'll like this one. Partisan judges, that's really strange, Judge. I found that very hard. Partisan judges, I never heard of any, may pick a partisan independent counsel, and no one will be held accountable since judges have life tenure. An independent counsel is selected in the scope of his authority prescribed by a panel of judges. What if they are politically partisan, as judges have been known to be, and select a prosecutor antagonistic to the administration or even to the particular individual who has been selected for this special treatment? There is no remedy for that, not even a political one. Judges, after all, have life tenure, and appointing a surefire, enthusiastic prosecutor could hardly be considered an impeachable offense. Number 8, and I don't know how close you've been following this, but this is probably his most uncanny prediction. The independent counsel statute creates incentives for the counsel staff to be comprised of bloodthirsty partisan hounds. Scalia's language. He writes, the independent counsel thus selected proceeds to assemble a staff. As I observed earlier, in the nature of things, this has to be done by finding lawyers who are willing to put aside their current careers for an indeterminate amount of time to take on a job that has no prospect of permanence and little prospect for promotion. One thing is certain, however, it involves investigating, perhaps prosecuting a particular individual. Can one imagine a less equitable manner of fulfilling the executive responsibility to investigate and prosecute? What would be the reaction if an area not covered by this statute, the Justice Department posted a public notice inviting applicants to assist in an investigation and possible prosecution of a certain named prominent individual? I would submit to you, in the case of the President's independent counsel and the selection of that staff, that is precisely what happened, and I'm happy to say that on the record. Now, I'm not defending the President. I'm complaining about this statute. 9, the independent counsel's jurisdiction may expand infinitely, Justice Scalia said. He said, should the independent counsel or her staff come up with something beyond that scope, nothing prevents him or her from asking the judges to expand his or her authority, or if that does not work, referring it to the Attorney General, whereupon the whole process would recommence, which is exactly what has happened here. And finally, he said, the independent counsel's isolation from the rest of the Justice Department will lead him to pursue and prosecute offenses that ordinary prosecutors probably would not. And then he said, in 1988, the independent counsel is intentionally cut off from the unifying influence of the Department of Justice and from the perspective that multiple responsibilities provide. What would normally be regarded as a technical violation, there are no rules defining such things, may in his or her small world assume the proportions of an indictable offense. What would normally be regarded as an investigation has reached the level of pursuing such picayune matters that it should be concluded may to him or her be an investigation that ought to go on for years. Written in 1988 by the most conservative member, in my view, and one of the most brilliant of the United States Supreme Court. Now, I've given you some background as to what I had proposed back in 1990 and what Scalia wrote in 88. And I look at the current situation. And I'll tell you what troubles me the most, and then we're going to have about a half an hour for questions. What troubles me the most is that in the last 2 independent counsel investigations I have watched carefully, there appears to be a lack of something that is absolutely essential, not only for judges, but I think also particularly for prosecutors, and that is balance. I do not believe this investigation of this president has had balance. Now, much of it he has brought upon himself, but I do not think this investigation has had balance. The result of that is that we've got into a situation in which my former colleagues, in my belief, have not only shot themselves in the foot, they have blown off their feet. I find it inconceivable that grand jury testimony and grand jury videotape would be put in a public domain before it is presented to a congressional hearing. If that isn't trying to pollute the jury, I don't know what is. But that is exactly what the independent counsel had the right to do, and under the statute, under his recommendation, the Congress had the full right to do exactly what it did. I believe that this president should have been investigated for the Whitewater matter, which is what this was all about, and were there anything else, it should be referred to somebody else. But to build an organization of 30 or 40 lawyers, anybody in the FBI who they want, smacks to me of the kind of oppression against any citizen, never mind it's the president, any individual, that the Bill of Rights is supposed to guarantee against. And we've learned something very interesting from this statute. We learned 200 years ago that we didn't want anyone over us who was unaccountable. We only wanted people who were accountable and who were removable by the people. We have now created, by this statute, in my view, the nightmare that the founding fathers saw what was going on they would not believe. We have a class of federal officers appointed under this statute who are essentially responsible to no one except themselves and can be removed only under the most extraordinary of circumstances and probably will not be. And who are willing to pursue, depending on who these people are, for years at the cost of millions of dollars. I'm sorry. That's what the Congress is all about. If the Congress finds a president or a federal judge, as I had the misfortune to have to sit on the impeachment of two federal judges, Judge Hastings and the judge from Judge Claiborne from Nevada. That was a very painful thing, but we did it. And we did it fairly. Although I must say it's kind of interesting. Judge Hastings, of course, we impeached. He was removed for bribery. Now a member of Congress from Florida. Co-sponsored the bill to repeal the independent counsel law. So. But the fact is that in a situation where a president is totally out of line, the Congress has all that it needs to do what it needs. We don't need independent counsels doing the work of the United States Congress. I abhor what has gone on in the last several months. I don't think it's good for the country. I think it's torn the country apart. It's going to tear the country apart even more. Whatever they do in Washington, let them follow the process. Let them do it with due process. Let them do it swiftly. Let them vote, and let's be done with it, because we have major problems facing America now, and they are not limited to the things that we see on the news every night. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to have to assume that I know the answer. I'm going to tell you the normal process is that the counsel is paid by an hourly rate that's agreed to, usually much less than normal hourly rate than that rate would be in one's private firm, and by at least New York and Washington billing rates, maybe not for Portland, and he would be paid that way. And, of course, it's not the pay of the independent counsel that's the problem. It's the support staff and the travel and everything else. Mr. Walsh, the independent counsel who ran Contra, traveled first class every weekend from Washington to his home in Oklahoma City and back again, and I believe stayed in a suite in the Jefferson Hotel for something like 4 years. Nice work. What do I think ought to happen or what will happen? Well, I won't tell you what I think ought to happen, because I don't think it really should. There have been too many opinions, too many talking heads. too many people who don't understand the facts. So I don't really want to say now what I think ought to happen, although I might be willing to when all the evidence is out. I've always thought it was kind of nice to look at the facts before you made up your mind. A novel idea, but I believe that the House of Representatives, if they've got the votes to have an impeachment hearing because he lied allegedly to a grand jury and he lied allegedly in a civil deposition, then they ought to do it. And they ought to do it quickly. They ought to bring their witnesses forward. They ought to let the president appear. And they ought to come to a conclusion and vote. And if they vote for impeachment, it should go right to the Senate, and the Senate should decide what it wishes to do. I will give you a political opinion, which is not the same as what you asked. And I know that place reasonably well. If all there is what we have now, in other words, if all of the crimes, the obstruction with Ms. Curry, the alleged obstruction with Ms. Curry, the alleged obstruction with the civil deposition, the alleged perjury, I should say, the alleged perjury in the grand jury, and that's all there is. All of that would have been based on an attempt to cover up an illicit sexual relationship. I would doubt very much if you would get 67 votes in the United States Senate to convict. I also think that there are still enough people of cool heads around to recognize that the last thing you want to do is have a partisan impeachment of a president, no matter what the circumstances. I don't think too many Republicans or Democrats really ought to disagree with that. You know, impeach a president, it ought to be people of goodwill disagreeing with each other based on philosophy and ideas and interpretation of law, not because I'm a Republican and he's a Democrat or vice versa. Now, if there's more, then I don't know what will happen, but my sense is that a lot of people in the country have taken the view that we don't like lying to grand juries and we don't like lying on civil depositions, and we sure don't like sexual relationships in the workplace between a 50-year-old man and a 22-year-old woman. But we elected the man president. We're reasonably happy with what he's doing. And if it's sex involved, sex is such a mysterious, difficult thing that we'll give you a pass on lying about that. We won't give you a pass on anything else, but everybody lies about sex. That's what all of the public opinion polls have shown. Very interesting. Very interesting. So my sense is that that's what would happen in those circumstances. Now, if there's more, I don't know. Yeah. The question is, how did the Graham-Rudman law contribute? It contributed a great deal, and that's by, everybody's statement. Essentially, it is still part of the law. What people don't realize, that still the law says if you want to appropriate money, it's going to be a zero-sum game. In the old days, you could say, you want another $100 million for rural health? We'll take something that Maine likes. Fine. $100 million for rural health? We'll do it. But you got to find $100 million someplace else. Cut it from the defense budget, cut it from college tuition, cut it from here, cut it from there. Before Graham-Rudman, you would just throw the $100 million in and nothing got cut. So that was an enormous change. Number two, it was really the first serious effort to move the budget around and point it downward. Nobody really thought it was possible. So it was the opening shot. It was the discipline that was needed, and I feel very good about it. We sure took a lot of guff about it at the time, as if we were trying to, ruin every worthwhile program in the world. The old Washington Monument syndrome. The National Park Service said, well, if the elevator in the Washington Monument in August, everybody have to climb the stairs, particularly cardiac patients. None of that happened, and, still around. I called Phil Graham up at 8 o'clock this morning at home. I said, Phil, better late than never, and he laughed. Somebody up here had their hand raised, please. Yeah, I had a hard time hearing at the beginning, but I think I understood your question, that if you did away with the independent counsel law, you would then just leave it to the Congress and you could have corruption and people would not, do anything about it. Was that the thrust of your question? Yeah. I don't think so, because I happen to believe enough in the majesty of this government. I happen to believe enough in the institution of the United States Department of Justice and all the career people that work there. I happen to believe in the FBI and the professional people that work there, that you really could work under the special counsel part of the tradition of the Attorney General of the United States, as they did with Cox and Jaworski. However, I'm not saying that the law ought to be thrown out. I'm willing to have the law kept, but for goodness sake, let's do some things that we've learned over the years to fix it. One of the two. My sense is they will not renew it at all. That's my sense. It'll be filibustered to death by somebody. It will not get reauthorized, in my view. But we'll see. But, if the President of the United States, President X, commits a horrible crime, we think he's guilty of bribery or something, and we're worried that the Attorney General, who is his campaign manager, ought not to be, investigating him. Let me tell you something. We've got enough professional people around this country in the Department of Justice. I would have no fear having justice professionals and FBI professionals run that investigation. In fact, I'd feel better about it than having an independent counsel in most cases, Ralph Lancaster accepted. Yes. Well, I will only tell you that campaign finance reform ought to be upon us. It's not. I'm not sure that any of the bills proposed would have done what they said they would do. I have one overriding thing I would like to have done. I would like to have it finally made absolutely unlawful for any corporation or any business entity, no matter how it is formed, give any money to any political candidate, and thus totally eliminate soft money totally. I would like to do that. The second thing I would like to do, and these are things I offered, which didn't get very far, for obvious reasons. I want these television stations, which are money machines, to do what is done overseas. Require them to give some free time in return for a pledge that the candidates will only use that free time and nothing else for political advertising. And require that negative advertising under those circumstances be in the name and the face of the person who's running for office, not a cartoon character. I think those are both constitutional. The National Association for Broadcasters has vigorously opposed that all the way. It would take 1/4% of their gross income. Those two things. Yeah. The question is, do we have any suggestions for the President of Congress to come to grips with the unfunded liabilities? We do. The Concord Coalition has put an enormous amount of material out on this. Our website is www.concordcoalition.org. We have an 888 number, and you could not guess it, 1-888-deficit. Hell, we won up Ross Perot. And we've got tons of information on that, and I don't want to, take everyone's time tonight, but if you're interested in that, we have it. We've got a great, small, but very good staff. Coalition will be running a full-page ad in the New York Times either this Sunday or the following Sunday, laying out some of the things you're asking about. Yes, sir. There are only two alternatives here. Alternative one, Newt Gingrich, Trent Lott, Henry Hyde, stand up tomorrow morning and say, Mr. President, we know you're sorry. We know you didn't mean it. Try to be better. Or you can follow the constitutional process. I believe in that process. The Founding Fathers didn't put it there by accident. Whether you agree that what brought it all there was right or wrong, isn't the point. There is no other alternative unless you simply say bye. One of the real problems here that I have come to a conclusion on, and I wonder if some of you may agree, and you're free to disagree. I'll tell you what I think is going on here in the public psyche, and I've been involved in law enforcement and juries and running for public office, and I think I have some sense of people in this country, particularly people up in this part of the country. I don't know about any other part of the country, but certainly up here, and I have a funny feeling most Americans are very similar. The problem in this matter is that there are no winners. There's no one to root for. There's no underdog. It's like the Iran-Iraq war. It was a terrible shame that anybody had to win. I mean, people are disgusted with the president. There's no question about that. They may have given job proposals. They are disgusted with the squalid behavior. They are angry at Starr, who went way beyond what any normal prosecutor would do. They're sore at the Congress for putting this information out. The only one they like is McGuire and Sosa. Sorry, Judge. So it is a very difficult situation. But the bottom line is that history is important. Tradition is important. The Constitution should not be taken lightly. There is evidence, whether it's about personal relations or not, there is evidence of possible obstruction, perjury, abuse of power by the highest officer in the land. You just can't sweep that away. You can't say, we'll do it the next 15 days and we'll have a vote. Can't do that. Shouldn't do that. Terrible precedent. And it's why I was delighted to see the Supreme Court of the United States finally say enough with all of these expedited cases they were rolling up and all of these phony executive privilege claims. They'll get knocked down. They'll get knocked down next year soon enough. So no, I don't know what else you can do. Yeah. I have an abiding belief in this country. You only have to travel around the world, as many of us have. You only have to fight in a foreign country to understand there is no place like this country. Churchill had it right. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. We're going through a very bad time now, it seems to me. President's conduct has not helped. The extreme partisanship shown by Republicans and Democrats in the Congress has not helped. But there are some very good people out there in public life. There are some very good people at the state level, at the national level. And it'll change. I'll make one prediction for you. I wouldn't predict Shep's question, but I will give you a prediction. The nominees for president in the year 2000 will be looked at very closely in terms of their records as citizens, as legislators, as human beings, and their characters are going to be looked at. But that don't mean peering into everybody's bedroom. But you can tell about the soundness of someone's character by what they've done. That wonderful story that you told about Bob Kerrey, Democrat from Nebraska, Congressional Medal of Honor. You had it almost right, Judge, but you did pretty good because what actually happened that night is that Kerry and I had talked a lot about the fact we'd both been in a lot of combat, had seen some similar horrible things, and there was a terrible debate going on, and I was smiling, and 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm just shaking my head. I couldn't believe how people were about to have coronaries over this issue, which was probably an abortion vote or something, or we had only 850 of those the first year I was in the Senate. I'm not exaggerating. Or it was an appropriation bill, and Bob walked over and he said, he was a freshman, he said, "Warren, what are you laughing about?" I said, "Well, you tell me, what am I laughing about?" He said, "You're laughing because they aren't firing real bullets." I said, "You've got it." Now talk about a guy with character. You look at a Bob Kerrey, I mean, you just know that a Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, a moderate Democrat, is a person of absolutely solid character who you could just depend on. You may disagree with some of his politics, doesn't mean you should vote for him, but you're going to know that. John McCain, a Republican from Arizona, 6 years in a Vietnamese prison camp, who told the North Vietnamese when they offered to let him go 2 years earlier, because his father at that point was the highest ranking naval officer in the United States Navy. People don't know that. John McCain was a young lieutenant. His father was Commander-in-Chief Pacific. And I said, John, Swiss Red Cross is here. We're taking you to Hanoi. We're flying you. You're on your way. And John, I will clean it up a little bit, said like hell. I will leave here when everybody else leaves here, and spend 2 more years there. It is not impossible to judge character. It doesn't have to be in a combat situation. It could be as a judge. It could be as a legislator. It could be as a volunteer worker. It could be as a parent. There are ways to judge character, and I predict that in the year 2000, it's going to count for something in this country. We have been through something as a nation, with all due respect, regardless of party, that we shouldn't have been put through. I believe that. I think we're a better country than what we have been put through. Senator, what? I would say, Judge Coffin, the first thing, learn the English language very well. I'm serious. No, really, learn the language. Learn how to use it and how to write it. And read some history. Read some history of your state and of the country. And kind of find out who you are and what you believe, because once you get elected, it's too late to find out. A lot of people will come and tell you what you believe. And then start at the local level and run for the city council or for the Maine legislature, the New Hampshire General Court. I happen to think, and I'm going to take this as the last question, it's been a long day, and I'll take it from the man who we honor tonight. I would say there is no higher calling, there is nothing I enjoyed more in my life than serving the public, whether it was as Attorney General of my state or as United States Senator. Nothing, no amount of money, no amount of fame, no amount of anything could give me more pleasure than that, and that is psychic income, which young people will richly enjoy if they learn and they do it, and thank you all very much.
I just want to thank Senator Rudman, Judge Coffin, and all of you here tonight. I also want to add a special word of thanks to my administrative assistant, Kelly Demers, who shouldered most of the burden for making this evening such a success. There she is in the back. And Assistant Dean Barbara Gauditz and Mary Nelson, our Development Director, who were also so helpful in bringing this day to a successful conclusion. I also want to make one more announcement, which is, will you please mark your calendars, save the evening of September 30th, 1999, when we will have our 8th Coffin lecturer, the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, will be with us then. So we look forward to seeing you all here next year. Again, our thanks to Senator Rudman. Have a good evening.